we're going to talk a little bit about some of the details of becoming president, some of the requirements, and all of those are found in Article 2 of the Constitution. Remember that the first 3 articles talk about the 3 branches of government. So Article 1 is going to talk about Congress. Article 2 talks about the executive branch, and Article 3 is going to tell you about the judicial branch. So there are a couple of pieces in here that I'm going to pull out and talk to you a little bit about. First, out of the 43 presidents, 25 of them have been lawyers. Many are very wealthy. Some of them have owned their own companies. Lots of them have gotten involved in the public sector for most of their adult life, so running for public office. Lots of them start out in Congress, and then they move on to the presidency, things like that. The minimum age to be a president is 35 years old. It says that in this line. The youngest president we ever had was JFK. He was 43 years old when he was elected into office. The oldest was Ronald Reagan. He was 69 years old when he was elected. So the average age of an incoming president is usually about 54 years old. I would be very surprised to see someone at the age of 35 be elected, simply because they just don't have a lot of experience. We tend to elect presidents who have some sort of government experience or record that we can go off of. Until 2009, when Barack Obama was elected, prior to that, all of our presidents had been white, male, and Protestant, except for John F. Kennedy, who was Roman Catholic. Obviously, Barack Obama changed that outlook a little bit. Some of the other requirements is that you have to be a resident of the United States for 14 years and a natural-born citizen. I've gotten a lot of questions from students in the last few months about this natural-born citizen because currently Ted Cruz, who's a candidate for presidency, is going through some controversy as to whether he is a natural-born citizen. He was born in Canada. The thing about being a natural-born citizen is that the way that it's written in the Constitution, natural-born citizen, is very vague. And so we believe that should a case come against Ted Cruz, he will be considered a natural-born citizen because his mother was a U.S. citizen at the time that she gave birth to him. It's a very vague reference, so it doesn't say, so it says a natural-born citizen. It doesn't say that necessarily that person has to be born on U.S. soil. It just sort of means that somebody in that line has to be a citizen of the United States. So there has been talk that someone will bring a case against Ted Cruz to remove him from candidacy, but most of the experts say that that case doesn't have a whole lot of validity and probably won't go very far. President Barack Obama also had the same controversy during his first term as president, whether he was a natural-born citizen, and obviously he is. He provided a birth certificate and all sorts of things. A lot of times it's used just as a political ploy, just to try and make it seem as though someone isn't qualified. Process of becoming a president is outlined in the 12th Amendment. This is a piece that says that if no president candidate receives a majority of electoral votes, it goes to the House of Representatives and the Senate to choose a candidate or to choose the president. A couple of interesting backgrounds. We have presidents that have all sorts of different backgrounds. Harry Truman owned a clothing store in the 1920s in Missouri. He is a very strong businessman. He was very successful. And then Ronald Reagan was an actor before he became president. It's one of the things he's known for. Okay, so a couple of things here. We're going to go through about 5 of the constitutional roles that the president has. What I really want you to understand here quickly before we get into each of these roles is that this is the one branch of government that has the most roles. It has been said that the executive branch is a very difficult branch to be the head of, meaning it's very hard to be the president these days because there are so many roles that you have to balance. And as an American people, we are very critical of our presidents and how they spend their time in each of these roles. It's almost a catch-22 situation for them because what we start to see is that if a president spends too much time in one role, we become very critical of the fact that maybe he should be doing something else. But if he's not doing enough of one role, we criticize him for not being or not using all of the roles that we give him. So it's a very difficult line for presidents to sort of balance on, to figure out how they're going to use each of these 5 roles effectively. And lots of past presidents will tell you that this was the most difficult part about being president, is that the way that they do their job, how they do their job on a day-to-day basis, seems up for our evaluation on a daily basis. For instance, I'll mention here really quickly, the Obama family has really struggled doing some of these roles. The president is always, under the scrutiny. So anytime the president goes on vacation, somebody writes some, piece about how he's not doing his job. Every time that the president flies, he has to take Air Force One. Someone always criticizes him for using taxpayer money to go somewhere that maybe he doesn't need to go to. It's not something that he can avoid. He has to take Air Force One. He couldn't just fly on a regular airline. But we seem to feel like it is our duty or our job to sort of analyze everything that the president does. And sometimes presidents can kind of handle that really well, and sometimes they don't. It's why you've seen the Obama family go from a very public political family to very, very private in the last few years. Michelle Obama does very few public addresses. The girls are never allowed to be filmed or photographed. And part of that is because they've come under such scrutiny in the last few years that they're just trying to avoid that criticism now. Okay, into some of these roles. Head of state. This is the ceremonial role of the president. So these are things like awarding war heroes, throwing out the first pitch at the opening season of baseball season, meeting with heads of state when they come to visit the United States, being sort of the face of the United States, sort of the ceremonial head of these things. And again, presidents who spend more time doing things like this is great, but they often get criticized for it. When they don't do enough of it, they get criticized for that. Chief executive is the idea that the president is the head of the executive branch, which is the idea that the main purpose of the executive branch is to execute the laws which have been passed by Congress. So it is his job to make sure that the things that we decide on as a government come to you as a constituent or as a member of the United States in an orderly fashion, that they're enforced in a specific way. He uses, obviously, a team to do this. And so we're going to talk about 2 of the powers that he has in this role. The first is that he has the power of appointment and removal. The president appoints a great deal of positions in the executive branch. All of the cabinet secretaries are appointed. Any openings in the Supreme Court would be appointed. Any ambassadorships would be appointed by the president. Advisors, head of military, committees or other advisory committees. And so this is really powerful because who the president appoints, who he trusts, who is in his ear telling him what to do or what not to do, is very important in what he actually does in kind of the day-to-day situation. And then the second power is really more around the judicial branch system. The president has the power to grant reprieves or pardons. Reprieves are basically official postponements of a person's sentence. Sometimes this is in a death penalty case, sometimes it's just simply a prison sentence or something like that. And then a pardon is just basically wiping the slate clean. It's actually an official formal release of punishment or legal consequences. Pardons are the most controversial piece here. Lots of presidents don't use their pardon power because of a couple of reasons. But we also see some politicians who use their pardon power a lot. It has sort of become an ideology piece where some politicians believe in it a lot, some politicians do not. And so it's a kind of a difficult thing to sort of balance on. What we really mean here, though, is when a president pardons, it often seems as though the president doesn't trust the judicial branch system, sort of going around, he's circumventing the system and saying, I grant you a pardon, you do not have to serve your sentence. And that can be dangerous for two reasons. First reason, you never want the judicial branch to not have trust in you, because as the president, you're going to need the judicial branch to uphold some of the laws that you execute. Number two, if it comes out that that person sort of behaves badly or doesn't follow guidelines later on after that pardon, that all comes back to the president. It's on his shoulders. And so a president usually doesn't want to take that responsibility for another human being, and so they often don't do that. Some of the most famous pardons, though, Gerald Ford pardoned Richard Nixon after he resigned from office for the Watergate scandal. That's always been debated in politics whether he should have done that or not. We'll often see presidents pardon a few people at the very end of their term, in the last few days of their presidency. A lot of times it can be a situation that the person knows about. Sometimes they'll pardon people so that they can get information from them or use them for other situations. There are a number of reasons why a pardon might come from a president. Next role is commander-in-chief. The commander-in-chief role is the idea that the president has all the final say in military expeditions or decisions. The president also has the final authority on any nuclear launches. So if you know anything about the president, he in the past would travel with a Secret Service or actually a military guard who would carry a briefcase with him at all times. We would call that the nuclear football. Inside that briefcase would be the codes to launch a nuclear missile, and the president would be the only one to have power to open that briefcase. Now we don't actually have the football. What we have is that the nuclear code launch are uploaded to an encrypted website daily. It's changed every day. And the president can only access it through a retinal technology scan. So they need his eye, sort of. And so we use that rather than having this briefcase follow the president, partially because the briefcase can easily be taken. And so it's a little bit safer that it's not with him every single minute of the day. Wartime powers are very prominent. The president's powers in war become much more extensive than when we are in peacetime. But in peacetime, the president does have some pretty big powers, and part of that comes from the War Powers Resolution. This was passed in 1973, and it allows the president to commit troops without congressional approval for 60 days. Sometimes that can be 90 days if the president asks for an extension. But essentially what this means is that the president can take military troops or aid to another country without having to formally declare war on that country. And we see presidents use this a lot because it kind of allows them to assess the situation and not have to declare war. So we see it all the time, and we often see some sort of agreement through Congress that's not necessarily a declaration of war, but sort of an agreement that, yes, this is okay, we do allow these things to happen. Things like the airstrikes that we're doing in Iraq and Syria right now, it hasn't officially been put under the War Powers Resolution, but the president is committing troops, right? He's sort of committing this action, and even if those troops aren't on the ground, they're working in a conflict situation. And so Congress and the president have been working to sort of make sure that that all stays how they want it to be. Chief diplomat is the idea that one of the president's roles is to go out into the world and to negotiate specific things with other countries to make sure that our country interacts with the world community in a good way. Diplomatic recognition is one of the biggest powers that the president has here. The president gets to recognize countries with legitimate governments. So one of the two most prominent pieces here, you probably know this, up until about a year ago, the United States did not recognize Cuba as a legitimate country. They didn't feel like they had a legitimate government under this dictatorship. And so the United States did not have any connections with Cuba economically, socially, politically at all. President Obama lifted that when the government changed a little bit and when it seemed as though they desperately needed to have some economic assistance. But things like Barack Obama, I think it was in his first term still, formally announced that we don't recognize the country of Syria right now because their government chemically bombed children in their country, and there's been a lot of acts of genocide in that country, and so we don't actually recognize Syria right now, meaning that we don't cooperate with Syria, we don't negotiate with Syria, It's not a country that we recognize to be legitimate. Proposal and ratification of treaties. So the president can go out, he can make treaties, but he has to have them ratified by the Senate. So it, again, is kind of a check on his power. He can go ahead and make all sorts of agreements with other countries, but in order for it to be a recognized treaty, that has to be recognized by the Senate. So we do see a lot of executive agreements. Executive agreements are agreements between our country and another country that don't have to be ratified by the Senate, which means that they don't actually have to be enforced if things came down to it. And what we often see presidents use executive agreements for is simply just building rapport with other leaders. He's got to be able to develop relationships and friendships and cooperation with other leaders, and sometimes he can just simply do that through an executive agreement. He doesn't have to involve Congress to ratify a specific treaty. However, when the going gets tough, those executive agreements can be broken. Okay, next is the chief legislator. So this is probably one of the most popular day-to-day roles of the president, and this is his ability to work with the legislative branch. We do know that he has a role in the legislative branch in the sense that he can either sign or veto legislation. And we talked a little bit about that last unit when we talked about the process of when a bill becomes a law. One of the things that I mentioned really quickly was that he essentially has 4 options. He does have a 5th option, which I'm going to talk about a little bit here, but I'll review those 4 options. First, he can pass the bill by signing it. He can veto the bill, and then he can pocket veto it, meaning he can leave it on his desk for 10 days. Should Congress be in session, that bill will become law. If they are out of session after the 10 days, then it doesn't become law. But no matter what, it doesn't have the signature of the president on it. But the 5th piece that I didn't talk about before is a line item veto. This was fought for by a number of presidents, but in today's world, we don't use the line item veto very often. It's more used as a threat. So in an appropriations bill specifically, a president can cross things out and then sign a bill to make it law immediately. It means that the president has a lot of power to alter the wording and meaning of a bill once it's on his desk. Most presidents don't use their line item veto power because it's sort of going behind Congress's back. It's sort of saying, I'm absolutely going to change the meaning of this law, and then I'm going to sign it, and it is going to become law, and you have nothing to say about it. And most of the time, the president isn't going to do something that hostile because these are a group of people that he has to work with, the next day. However, we do see presidents often threaten. So they'll often go back to congressional leadership and say, hey, the president's willing to line item veto this unless you alter it to be something more reasonable. And then Congress obviously has the power to override a presidential veto. It doesn't happen very often, it's very rare, but there, obviously is some power there. One of the other pieces that you should definitely mention if you're ever asked about the president's role as chief legislator is his State of the Union address. It's the most public, most prominent way every year that the president gets to outline his agenda to the people and sort of get his point across to Congress. So we use the State of the Union a lot. In fact, next week we're going to watch it so that you can get a sense of what some of the agenda pieces are for this year, although this State of the Union was very unique. We'll talk about that later. This is a graphic in your book that I think is really interesting. Again, you want to take a look at trends here. So this is presidential success by year in presidencies. One of the things you need to know here is that you'll see the first few years of a presidency are the highest as far as success goes. That's because a president walks into office with the most momentum and the highest approval rating that he will often see for the rest of the presidency. So you'll often see presidents say things like, in my first 100 days. Lots of the candidates are saying things like that right now. And a lot of that is because they know that those first 100 days are crucial. Without getting things done in that first 100 days, odds are very slim that you'll get a lot of other things done. So you often see presidents really hit the ground running because they're trying to use that momentum, that approval to get things passed before things start to go down a little bit. You'll see that President Bush keeps a really strong approval rating for a pretty long time, and a lot of that is because of the war in Iraq and the terrorist attacks. His presidency, when you look at the numbers, especially in approval and success, it's a very unique situation. And so when you look at his numbers, you sort of have to analyze what's been happening in the world at that time. Okay, there are some other presidential powers that we need to talk about. Statutory powers are powers that are given to him because of passing laws. Statutory or statutes are often words to describe laws that have been passed. This is the idea that when Congress passes a law and asks the president to execute that law, which is his job, there are some powers that the president has to have simply because he has to get it done. So things like communicating with other branches of government, making sure that agencies in the government understand regulations and rules, and doing that in whatever ways he feels fit or he sees fit are considered his statutory powers. Express powers are the specific powers that are listed in Article 2 of the Constitution. They're black and white, says exactly what the president can and cannot do. And then inherent powers are just the ideas that there are powers that the president has that aren't going to be written anywhere, and that's simply because he has to run our country, and we can't write down every single power that the president has. So for instance, things like the power to come and talk to people, to have public addresses. He has to do that. That's his job. He has to make sure that the American people know what he's doing. Those are powers that aren't probably listed anywhere specifically. We just call them inherent powers. Things like talking to other heads of state. He's not really listed anywhere that that's something he gets to do, but obviously he needs to do that because our country has to interact in a worldwide community. And so these are what we call inherent powers. They're sort of implied or assumed because our country is a functioning country in a worldwide situation. Okay, the president as the chief of the party is a pretty big deal. Obviously, the president is seen as the highest member of whatever party he belongs to. So right now, the president is a Democrat, and he's sort of considered the chief of the party. Now, does he do a lot of day-to-day decisions for the party? No. He's again sort of seen as a ceremonial leader of the party. He will elect a chairperson to the party, so the Democratic National Chairperson is appointed by the president, and that's the person who does the day-to-day work. So making sure that the convention is ready to go, finding candidates for districts or states that may have openings in another election, continuing to spread good news about the party, things like that. There are two main jobs that the president has as the chief of party. First is that he's a major fundraiser for the party. So he will often go to lots of public events to gain donations and contributions to the party. And that, of course, is if he's actually in a high approval rating situation. If he's not in a high approval rating situation, you'll often see the president not doing a whole lot of fundraising for the party. The party doesn't want to use somebody who's not doing very well in his job as an example of the party. And then the second piece is patronage. The president has the opportunity to appoint people based on their loyalty to the party or to their campaign. And we see presidents do this all the time. Republican, Democrat, it doesn't matter, it happens all the time. And I'll give you two examples. Think back to when we watched the Hurricane Katrina documentary and the head of FEMA was really struggling. Part of that is because the president, George W. Bush at the time, nominated him as the director of FEMA out of patronage. This is the man who had spent a great deal of time and money and effort to get President Bush elected. He's a very loyal member of the Republican Party. And so President Bush saw this opening in the FEMA directorship, and he gave it to this man as patronage, sort of a reward. However, what you can learn from President Bush's mistake is that there are some positions that you can't really fill with patronage. You certainly need an expert. And that's kind of what bit President Bush back, is that he ended up really suffering for that position because he elected or nominated somebody who really wasn't equipped to handle an actual emergency. But But you'll see it even like President Barack Obama. If you notice, right after he was elected president, he nominated Hillary Clinton to be his Secretary of State. Odds are probably good, it's been talked about a lot, that once Hillary Clinton decided to leave her candidacy, her team met with Barack Obama's team and said, hey, we would really like to endorse you. We'd really like to send all of our Clinton members to your voter team. However, we'd really like something in return. And Barack Obama probably promised that she would get a prominent cabinet position, which is why she was Secretary of State for the first few years of his presidency. So kind of take a look at some of those endorsements. I really wouldn't be surprised to see that if Donald Trump became the Republican nominee or the president, I wouldn't be surprised to see Sarah Palin as a prominent cabinet position or even a VP ticket person again, because her endorsement comes with something. And usually that's a piece of patronage. It's sort of the idea of, I'm going to scratch your back, how are you going to scratch my back? And so you'll see that a lot in candidacies. The president's power to persuade is obviously a huge deal, especially as the chief of the party, trying to make sure that the party will follow him, will approve of the things that he does. And then constituents and public approval. I'm not going to spend a great deal of time on this because we talked a lot about it when we talked about polling. One of the things you need to know about, though, is that when it comes to constituencies, the most important constituency for the president is actually the people in Washington, D.C. Presidents really want approval ratings from the people of the American people, but in reality, they don't do a lot to make his job any easier or less easy. He really needs the people in Washington, D.C. He needs Congress people, he needs advisors, he needs the heads of lots of departments to be in his favor. And so he really appeals a lot to his Washington, D.C. constituency. Public approval, obviously, is also a very big deal, though. George W. Bush is mentioned in your book because he had the highest reported approval rating ever right after September 11th in 2001. But then you'll see as he leaves office, about 8 years later, 7 years later, he has some of the lowest approval ratings. Part of that is because of kind of the failed attempt of the war in Iraq. Part of it is some of the decisions that he made at the very end of his term. So you really can see a president hit his very highest highs, very lowest lows within his single presidency. And then this is the last slide that I'm going to do really quickly, and it's Barack Obama and popular approval. Barack Obama had the highest approval rating when he got into office. He had this really strong momentum for about the first 2 years of his presidency, and slowly things have started to go a little bit south. One of the things that he's doing a lot is a concept called going public. In order to try and boost those approval ratings, he's going around Congress and going directly to the American people. This is a technique that can work really well, but it can also really backfire. And I'm not entirely sure how it's going to go for President Obama right now. But I will bring your attention to a situation that kind of highlights this a little bit. About a month ago, the president came out in this really big press conference to announce that he was signing an executive agreement to close the gun show loophole. Essentially not really close it, but sort of to add more background checks to gun ownership. He does that by executive agreement, which means that he doesn't need Congress to approve it. Part of the reason why he does that is because he knows Congress won't approve it. He wants to get some things done. He wants to show that he's an effective president. And part of it's because he's using a technique called going public. He's going right to you. And he appealed in a really emotional speech that this is something that needed to get done. Now, it could work in his favor, but it could also really go against him. For people who really believe that the government should go through this very systematic process of Congress and then the president, they're not going to be super in favor of this idea of going public. For some people who feel like, hey, we're not getting anything done with Congress, maybe this is going to gain him a couple of approval points. Good morning. May I have your attention, please? A couple of high school announcements. Those honor band students should report to the office area at this time. Also for our high school students, Mrs. Lund has a pizza sample